Naomi Jefferson had always believed in the power of hard work. Growing up in a dominantly black neighborhood, she had seen firsthand the barriers that stood in the way of people like her, and she had always been determined to overcome them. Raised by parents who valued education and self-reliance, Naomi learned early on that the world didn't always see black women as equals. But she was taught never to let that stop her. She took pride in her resilience and in the example she was setting for her son, Malik. Her life had been a testament to the success that comes from perseverance. She had earned her bachelor's degree in computer science and worked her way through medical school, eventually becoming a successful pediatrician. Alongside her husband Daniel, who was a software engineer, they had built a life of security and comfort. After many years of working in the bustling city, they made the decision to move to a quieter suburban neighborhood, hoping for more peace and a safe, nurturing environment for Malik, who was now 16 and entering a critical phase of his life. The move to the predominantly white upper-middle-class neighborhood was meant to symbolize progress. Naomi had always thought of herself as someone who could bridge gaps between different worlds. She was a successful, well-spoken professional, and she assumed her family's accomplishments would speak for themselves. They weren't just anyone moving in. They were the Jeffersons, a family whose hard work had earned them the right to live wherever they pleased. But from the moment they moved into the beautiful, spacious home at the end of the tree-lined street, Naomi could feel the subtle tension in the air. At first, Naomi brushed off the odd glances from the neighbors. She had learned long ago not to take every look or comment as an insult. Sometimes, she told herself, people just needed time to get used to something different. The white families on her street had likely lived there for years, surrounded by people who looked like them. It was only natural that her family's presence might take some getting used to. But the unease Naomi felt didn't go away. It lingered, hovering just under the surface like a persistent hum. It was during her morning walks that Naomi first started to sense the undercurrents of discomfort. She loved taking Rocky, her golden retriever, for walks around the neighborhood. It was one of the few times in her busy day when she could relax, clear her head, and enjoy the peace and quiet of the suburban streets. But every now and then, as she strolled past the meticulously kept lawns and beautiful, pristine homes, she would notice the way her white neighbors would stop and stare. One morning, as Naomi walked past a group of white neighbors standing on a driveway, their conversation abruptly stopped. The silence was noticeable. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from polite respect, but rather the uncomfortable kind that seemed to carry the weight of questions they wouldn't ask aloud, but that were implied through their stares. Naomi felt the familiar sensation of being watched, not with curiosity, but with suspicion. Mrs. Parker, one of the older women in the group, waved, but her smile seemed forced, as though she wasn't sure if she was supposed to greet Naomi or ignore her. Naomi nodded back politely, but felt the unease settle deep in her chest. As she walked away, she could feel their eyes on her back, the way people's gazes linger when they don't quite know how to react. It wasn't the first time she had felt out of place, but it hurt in a way she hadn't expected. She had thought those days of being judged by her skin color were behind her, especially now that she had achieved so much in her life. She pushed the feeling aside, reminding herself that it was just a matter of time. People would get used to her family, she reasoned. Once they got to know her, they'd see that she and her family weren't any different from anyone else on the block. But no matter how much Naomi tried to rationalize the discomfort, the feeling lingered. A few days later, as she returned from one of her morning walks with Rocky, Naomi noticed something that made her heart sink. A police car was slowly pulling up in front of her house. Naomi's breath caught in her throat, and her first instinct was to look around, wondering what might have happened in the neighborhood. But the answer came quickly when the two officers stepped out of the car and approached her. They didn't seem aggressive or confrontational, but there was a firm authority in their demeanor. One of the officers asked her if she lived there, while the other took a quick glance at the notepad in his hand. Naomi's pulse quickened. She knew what this was about. Someone had called the police on her, likely one of her neighbors, who had seen her walking around and decided that she was a suspicious person. Naomi kept her voice calm and steady as she explained to the officers that she did, in fact, live there, showing them her ID and answering their questions. But inside, she was seething. She knew that if she had been white, none of this would be happening. She was a well-respected doctor, a mother, a wife. She had done nothing wrong. She was simply living her life. And yet, because she was a black woman in a predominantly white neighborhood, someone had felt threatened enough to call the police on her. The officers apologized and left after confirming her identity, but the incident left Naomi rattled. She stood outside for a moment, staring at the spot where the police car had been parked, trying to process what had just happened. A part of her wanted to march over to her neighbors and demand to know who had called the police. But she didn't. Instead, she walked inside and shut the door behind her, feeling the weight of her reality settle over her like a thick, suffocating blanket. That night, Naomi didn't mention the incident to Daniel or Malik. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she didn't want to worry them, or maybe she didn't want to admit to herself how much it had hurt. But the next morning, as she walked past the same houses and the same neighbors, she couldn't help but wonder, who had made that call? Was it Mrs. Parker, with her forced politeness? Or was it someone else, someone who had been watching her from behind closed blinds? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but there was no way to know for sure. The following weekend, Naomi and Daniel decided to host a small barbecue in their backyard. It was meant to be a fun, relaxing afternoon with family and friends, a way to enjoy their new home and connect with the people who mattered most to them. They invited a few close friends from the city, all of whom were black, and set up a grill and some tables in the spacious backyard. The day started off wonderfully. There was laughter, music, and the smell of burgers grilling on the barbecue. Naomi was in her element, hosting and making sure everyone had a good time. But as the afternoon wore on, she began to notice something. Across the fence, a few of their white neighbors had started to gather. They weren't joining in the fun or even coming over to introduce themselves. Instead, they stood on their porches or peered out from behind their curtains, watching. Naomi could feel their eyes on her and her guests. She could sense their discomfort, even though nothing inappropriate or out of the ordinary was happening. But the more she noticed their gazes, the more it became clear this wasn't just about curiosity, it was about suspicion. In their eyes, a group of black people gathering in a backyard was cause for concern, even though they were doing nothing more than enjoying an afternoon barbecue. Then, out of nowhere, Mr. Davidson, one of the older men who lived a couple of houses down, called out from across the fence, "You all are making a lot of noise over there." His voice was sharp, cutting through the laughter and music. "This is a quiet neighborhood, not the city." His words hung in the air like an accusation. Naomi's first instinct was to check the time. It was only 3 in the afternoon, not exactly the kind of time when a barbecue would be considered disruptive. And the noise wasn't excessive. They were simply laughing and talking, like any other group of friends at a social gathering. But Naomi knew immediately what this was about. It wasn't about the noise. It was about her and her black friends being too visible, too loud, too different. She kept her voice calm as she responded, explaining that they were just having a small get-together and assuring him that they would be mindful of the noise. But Mr. Davidson wasn't satisfied. He wasn't really concerned about the volume. He was concerned about who was making the noise. His face was red, his eyes narrowed, and his stance rigid. He pointed toward Malik, who had been playing soccer with a few friends on the lawn. "And your son, he damaged my lawn the other day. I saw him." Naomi's heart sank. She knew that Malik hadn't been anywhere near Mr. Davidson's yard. The accusation was baseless. But it was clear that Mr. Davidson had decided, based on nothing more than the color of Malik's skin, that he was a troublemaker. Naomi could feel the tension rising in the air, and she knew she had to tread carefully. She stood her ground, defending Malik and making it clear that her family had done nothing wrong. But the confrontation left her feeling drained and angry. This was supposed to be their home, a place of peace and comfort. And yet, here they were, being policed by their neighbors for simply existing. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, Naomi couldn't help but feel like a stranger in her own home. The weeks that followed were marked by more subtle but painful reminders that Naomi's family wasn't truly welcome in the neighborhood. There were the looks, the whispers, the uneasy smiles that never quite reached the eyes. It was the kind of racism that wasn't spoken aloud, but was felt in every interaction, every sideways glance, every unnecessary comment about how quiet the neighborhood used to be. Then one afternoon, Naomi experienced the final straw. As she drove home from the clinic, exhausted after a long day of seeing patients, she noticed a police car in her rearview mirror. Her stomach dropped. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't breaking any traffic laws, but she had a sinking feeling that she knew what was about to happen. The officer nodded, but his eyes didn't soften. He explained that they had received a call from a neighbor about a suspicious vehicle in the area. Naomi couldn't believe it. Again, someone had called the police on her, simply because she was a black woman driving through her own neighborhood. She felt the humiliation rise in her throat as the officer asked her to step out of the car, even though she had done nothing wrong. As she stood on the side of the road, answering the officer's questions, Naomi could feel the eyes of her neighbors on her. A few had gathered on their porches, watching the scene unfold. She knew what they were thinking. To them, she was an anomaly, an outsider, someone who didn't quite belong. The officer eventually let her go, but the damage had been done. As Naomi drove the rest of the way home, tears of frustration welled up in her eyes. How many more times would she have to prove that she belonged? How many more times would she be treated like a suspect in her own community? That night, Naomi sat down with Daniel and Malik to talk about what had happened. Malik, who had always been a joyful, carefree teenager, was now quieter, more withdrawn. He had felt the sting of racism for the first time, and it weighed on him in ways Naomi hadn't anticipated. He expressed his anger and confusion, asking why they had to deal with this, why people treated them this way. Daniel, always the calm and steady presence, tried to shield his family from the worst of it, but even he was beginning to feel the emotional toll. No matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they achieved, they were still seen as outsiders, as people who didn't belong in this world of white picket fences and manicured lawns. Across the neighborhood, the white families were dealing with their own realizations. Some, like Mr. Davidson, continued to justify their actions, insisting that they were just being cautious or protecting the neighborhood. Others, like Mrs. Parker, began to question their own assumptions. Mrs. Parker had never thought of herself as racist. She had always prided herself on being open-minded and kind. But after witnessing the way Naomi's family had been treated, she couldn't deny that she had played a role in it. She remembered the time she had called the police, mistaking Malik for someone who didn't belong in the neighborhood. It was a sobering realization, one that forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth about her own biases. The neighborhood's icy distance and polite racism were suddenly shattered one evening when a medical emergency occurred. Mr. Davidson's granddaughter, Lily, was playing in the front yard when she suddenly collapsed. Panic erupted as neighbors frantically tried to help, but it was clear that none of them had any idea what to do. Mrs. Parker ran up and down the street, calling out for help, but no one seemed to have the necessary medical knowledge to deal with the situation. It was in that chaotic moment that Mrs. Parker's eyes fell on Naomi's house. She hesitated for a brief second, knowing the tension that had been simmering between her and the Jeffersons, but then, without thinking, she ran to Naomi's door and pounded on it. Naomi opened the door to see a frantic Mrs. Parker, gasping for air as she explained that Mr. Davidson's granddaughter had collapsed and wasn't breathing properly. Instinct kicked in for Naomi, and she immediately grabbed her medical bag, sprinting across the street to help. When Naomi reached Lily, she quickly assessed the situation. The little girl had an underlying condition that Naomi recognized immediately, and she calmly administered care. Her knowledge and professionalism in that moment were undeniable. Within minutes, Lily's breathing stabilized. The ambulance arrived soon after, and the paramedics took over, but by that point, it was clear that Naomi had saved the little girl's life. The following days were a blur. The neighborhood was still buzzing from the incident, and word quickly spread that Naomi, the woman many had treated with suspicion, was the one who had saved Mr. Davidson's granddaughter. Naomi went back to her regular life, not expecting any thanks, but what happened next surprised her. A few days later, there was a knock at Naomi's door. When she opened it, she found Mr. Davidson standing there, his face solemn and his eyes filled with regret. Behind him stood Mrs. Parker and several other neighbors. Mr. Davidson, normally so gruff and judgmental, seemed almost vulnerable in that moment. I just wanted to thank you," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "You saved my granddaughter's life. I can't begin to tell you how grateful I am." Naomi looked at him, her face impassive, waiting for him to continue. "And I've been wrong," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I've been judging you and your family without ever getting to know you. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Mrs. Parker stepped forward next. "I'm so sorry too," she said softly. "I've realized how unfair I've been. I was scared for no reason, and I let my own fears cloud my judgment. You didn't deserve that." One by one, the neighbors expressed their regret. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was a start. Naomi listened quietly, her emotions a mix of relief and exhaustion. She hadn't asked for their approval, but the apology was a weight off her shoulders. It didn't erase the hurt, but it was the first step toward real change. From that day forward, things in the neighborhood began to shift. The Jeffersons were no longer seen as outsiders. Naomi's neighbors began to wave genuinely when she walked by, and there were even a few moments of real connection. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And for the first time since moving in, Naomi felt like her family was starting to belong. Thank you for watching. If Naomi's journey and her fight for acceptance resonated with you, let's continue the conversation. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to this channel for more stories that inspire reflection and change. Together, we can raise awareness, spark discussions, and make a difference.